Hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Dr. Anthony Cliffe. In this session today we're going to talk you through interview design. So by now you should have watched the previous video, which is about the 3 different types of interview that you can do. Now we're going to discuss how to actually design your interview, what interview length you should be looking for, what language should you use, any sensitive questions you might want to think about, your sampling, your saturation, and some participant information sheets, and a little bit about risk and ethics as well. So it's not just a simple case of asking a question. There is a lot of design and psychology and ethical considerations that you've got to think about to be an effective and complete researcher. So let's crack on. So one thing that often gets asked in research is, well, how long should an interview last? Now, there's no real right answer here. There really isn't. So, in literature, other researchers will give a figure. They'll often say around 30 minutes to an hour. However, from personal experience, time really does not often equate to quality in research. Something that I've done, a 10-minute focused interview can be just as effective as an hour-long interview. It depends on what data you're trying to collect. It depends on the interviewer that you've got, the interviewee. It really does, it's a piece of string job, so don't get too caught up. Any research I do tend to do, however, I've often found around 45 minutes to 55-minute interviews for bigger projects is relatively suitable because it allows you to explore your numerous questions, it allows you to explore new ones, and it does keep the respondent engaged. When you think about it, they're talking about their lives for, 3/4 of an hour. If you start going over that, you start going over an hour, people start to get a little bit bored, and you will notice that how they actually speak and what depth of information you get as your time goes up on your interview, that's going to go down. So you've got to be careful of that. And of course, everyone loves the chatty interviewee, which is great. You could probably talk for 2 hours about a topic. Of course you could. But sometimes, people are very shy. It's like pulling hen's teeth. So you've got to weigh that up. And as well, always remember the fact that, if you start going over an hour, you've still got to transcribe that. So if you start going up to 2 hours, then roughly, I think on average, it's between 5 and 7 hours for a novice researcher to code and transcribe. Sorry, to transcribe, not even code, but to transcribe an interview. If your interview lasts an hour, you're probably looking between 5 and 7 hours to actually transcribe that interview if you're doing it yourself. So obviously, if you're going to 2 hours, then you're looking at close to 10 hours for you to take out of your day, and that's pretty much a full working day to actually just transcribe that one interview. So you've got to weigh up that roughly stick to around 3/4 of an hour, I would say. Now, language use. So it's vital that you get this right when you're developing your questions for your interview, because there's 4 things that you have to consider: clarity, accessibility, the direct nature of the question, and how biased or leading it may be. So, clarity then. So, a cardinal sin of a poor interviewer is asking a question within a question. Okay, so I'm filming this in April 2020, and it's in the UK during the COVID-19 crisis. We've had people who have asked the government every day in the briefing. Now, please do watch them. That's a perfect example of poor interviewing technique, where a reporter is asked a question within a question. That's really bad because the interviewee has to then process that first one, formulate an answer, and then follow the second one. They very rarely ever answer either of them effectively because their brain is too busy focusing on juggling the 2 of them. So please do stick to one question in your question. Remember, you have time to ask the other question as a follow-up or you're in another set of questions. So another thing that you need to be careful of in terms of clarity is clarity in what you're asking them. So define terms of what you mean. So, for example, Tell me about a time you felt affected by flooding in your home. Got to define what you're looking for. Are you looking for them to discuss financial implications of their effectiveness of that flood? Um, so what is it that you're trying to define? So it's perfectly fine to ask this and get them to direct the question, but you also then need to say, so for example, if the flood caused you any financial concerns, so you've got to give them a little bit of clarity of what you mean, what you're trying to find about the effectiveness of flooding in that home, for example. Accessibility. So this is similar to researcher impression management. It is about how you will be conducting your interviews. And I'm going to come on to this a little bit later about researcher impression management because that's really important. But if you get the interviewer to come to you, will you reward them for their time, and how does that affect impression management? We've conducted it via Skype or now, certainly in COVID-19, and there will be a video that pops up just now about how to set up interviews for online during this current crisis. If you are, what considerations technology, will they have access to this? And you've got to be accessible as well. So not every interviewer will be easy. Every researcher who's been doing qualitative stuff for a long time will have a story about their most difficult interviewer. I remember mine perfectly clear. It was the second I started a job as a research assistant just after I finished my masters, and the second one I ever did. So I was already nervous as an interviewer, a relatively novice researcher. And the second interview I ever had with a person was horrific. They were argumentative, very very difficult to work with, and I was not expecting that. Now, every researcher has a story like that, where you do an interview and the yes/no answers, and it's very hard to get any information out of them. Everyone will have that. You may do 1,000, and it might be 1,001, or like me, it might be your second one, and you're going to have that. So you've just got to be careful that not every interview is going to be easy. So direct. So you want to be direct, but you don't want to be forceful in how you ask your questions. And this is a challenge. It is a challenge for that balance. So some people are more tactful and social than others, than other interviewers. So if you're very introverted, you may well have to work on this. If you're not used to that social interaction of how you actually broach different questions, reading the room, reading their body language, that kind of stuff. And it does take time. It really does take time to have an effective interview craft. So for those who have not watched my previous videos, I'm a pragmatist. I'm a mixed methods researcher, and I basically started doing some qualitative in the past couple of years, and I still struggle with it. I still have things that I can do a lot better as interview craft. So just keep working on it. So you've got to constantly weigh up how you shape the focus of the interview in light of the new information that you get. If someone goes off on a tangent, how do you get them back? And again, this can be really difficult. Sometimes you do have to be direct and just be like, okay, thanks for that information, but we're going to come back to the question now. They may well be slightly offended, but that's what it is. You don't want to keep dragging on off on a tangent, because it's wasting their time, it's wasting yours in terms of research time. Again, avoid jargon and overcomplicatedly long questions. So you're going to be decisive, firm, but friendly. And especially when dead ends start occurring. So like I say, they start going off on a tangent, you've got to be brave and bring them back into line. Bias. So bias is your number one enemy as an interviewer, because you've got to, where questionnaires can be designed in such a way to eliminate this bias. So the fact that they're asked in a way you're not physically there, there's still an element of bias in terms of, I think they want me to say this, but you're faceless. They don't know who you are as the researcher. You don't know them, if it's an online questionnaire particularly. Whereas in an interview, they're very much face to face. They might think, this person's interviewing me, this is what I should say. Now, you've also got to be careful in how you actually deliver your questions if you deliver them as biasly. So you don't want to have any questions that are going to cause harm or lead a respondent on. So you don't want to already put some thoughts in their head. So for example, I've done a question here. You should never ask a question like this, which is, would you say that you really blame the local council for their poor flood action plan? So have a think to yourself, what's wrong with that question? So this is what we often call a loaded question in research. Where you can almost view it as you're putting words into the interviewee's mouth. Plus, it's relatively negative and it's biased to the viewpoint of the interviewee. So, as we before, we were already saying it's really poor. You're already putting that into their heads. What you should ask is really, can you tell me what you think of the local council's flood action plan? Very neutral, unbiased. They may well say it's poor, but that's up to them to decide. You're not physically putting that into their mouth. Again, you want to try and keep your opinions to yourself. So, you may feel very strongly for or against something that your respondent has said, but you've got to try and limit this interaction. So yes, it is a conversation, of course it is. But I've done interviews before where I fundamentally, as a person, disagree with what that person has said about a particular topic, but that's research. You've got to compartmentalise that and carry on doing the interaction, carry on doing the interview. You don't want to let your personal opinions get a hold of that, because that's going to then lead into some biased questions. Now, if you are a fully qualitative person and you understand the risks and limitations of you as a qualitative paradigm, you may use this bias to your advantage. So, you may use this to work some rapport with your interviewees. For example, if they do say something, you might well agree with them and say, oh yeah, I actually do agree with that, and use that as a basis to talk more. But you've just got to realise that there is inherent bias in that. And if you acknowledge that, then great. But if you go ahead blindly doing that without acknowledging your bias, that may well affect your results. So sensitivity, again, interviews are personal because you're coming into their lives and you're asking them to divulge information about themselves, so it is already sensitive. Now, quite often you may well be told some sensitive information, and at times, again, I've done this for a number of years now, and there's a couple that do stick in my mind where they've told you something which you really do have to think about as you go through after the interview's finished. You're like, wow, that was really personal. They really opened up there. And sometimes you really will get caught off guard. So you've got to act professionally, and you've got to ensure that information is kept private and confidential. There are some stories that I've heard in interviews, but you just can't divulge it because that is that agreement between you and that person. So topics can be very emotive for these people because, say, if you're discussing around any disaster management or anything that's happened in the past, it can be very emotive to them, and so it can be a challenge for you to navigate those issues and deal with them. Now, often again, it's very challenging to you as a researcher for if you ask a question and your participant gets very defensive because they don't want to talk about it because it is such an emotive topic. It's up to you then whether you leave that and you're happy to, because they're under a little bit of distress, to leave that completely, that set of data, or is there a different way you can ask it and to tease that information out? So you've got to make that snap decision when you're in there. Because you remember, the best interest for you as an interviewer is to have your best interest of your interviewee as your key priority, okay? So if they are feeling super distressed, they don't want to talk about it, the data is not worth getting if your participant is going to be distressed about it. So their safety is number one, and then your data comes number two. So, and also remember, you're going to be recording these interviews, so make sure that you have permissions and that you save all the files as per your ethics application. Another big question that people often ask is, when do I have enough data? When do I stop? So for questionnaires, well, you'll have a target number, you'll have a sample number that you must reach in order to run your statistical tests and generalise. Unfortunately, for interviews, that isn't the case. We don't have that. In textbooks, researchers will often give what I think is relatively arbitrary numbers. They'll usually say between 10 and 50, roughly, there or thereabouts. But in real life, we actually stop when we reach a thing called data saturation. And that can be after 5, or it could be after 100 interviews. So what do I mean by data saturation? Data saturation is when you start hearing the same answers from your questions across your population. Now, if you're interviewing the general wider UK public, then of course, yeah, you may well be up in this range in the 50s until you're not actually generating any new knowledge because people are saying the same things. If you have a relatively small population, so if you're looking at a very particular cohort, you may well reach it after 5, you may well reach it after 10. So just think about it, if you're asking questions and you're doing the interviews, and by the time you get to your 6th or even your 4th one, and people are answering the same questions in the same way, you kind of know that you've reached data saturation. So there is no set number, it is judged on feel. So like I say, you stop when you start to hear your interviews give the same information. And basically, as I mentioned here, you as the researcher, it is up to you when you've hit saturation. And as long as you can justify that in your analysis of your data, then that's what you do. Don't let anyone else dictate to you as a researcher whether you should carry on or whether you should stop, because you've got to not only factor in what data you're getting, but also cost and time for your project as well. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit before about researcher bias and impression management. So for me, this is something that isn't often discussed in terms of research. It's only for delivering interviews and that kind of stuff. But I think it is imperative that people understand it. So there is inherent bias, as I mentioned before, by you conducting face-to-face interviews, either be that in person, be that via Skype, be that online. Because you're present, that's going to affect how a respondent may or may not answer those questions, and have their true thoughts and feelings to you, because you're physically present. So you've got to, not only that, when you're transcribing, you're selecting what words to put in there, what quotes you pull out, you're selecting what quotes to suit your narrative, to suit whatever research question that you're trying to do. So there's always bias in research of this nature. But impression management is, and that's well addressed in research. You'll see plenty of stuff over there about inherent bias of interviews. But what people don't often talk about, and it's still a relatively new emerging area, is impression management. So you've got to think about how you dress, where's the interview location, are any food and drinks offered, all of that can influence the interviewee. So it's not often discussed in research, but how you dress might influence the respondent. So for example, if I was interviewing students, I would not come in a shirt and tie and act very businesslike, because that's already creating a power dynamic of I'm different from you, I'm the researcher, you're the participant. I may well go, not even like this, I would go probably a lot more casual. I'm in a different setting. If I are interviewing senior managers, then again, I wouldn't turn up in a tracksuit. You want to be professional, you want to mimic them. So you want to eliminate that power dynamic through the way that you dress. Now, often as well, certainly if you're dealing with the general public, ties, shirts and ties, blazers can often have that area of authority. So if you want to conduct your interview like that and you want to have that power dynamic, as long as you address that and you know it, that's fine. But often you probably want to go with smart casual for general public. But again, some people might think, well, they've gone casual, so therefore this interview doesn't mean much. If you dress smart, it's going to influence them. So you've just got to have that idea of that. Where you meet as well and their location is also important. So people are actually, again, we mentioned power dynamics and power relationships. People are often very territorial, and they might not even realise that. So you as a researcher, if you invite them into your office, well, that's your home ground. Imagine there's a football stadium, that's your home stadium. You know the lay of the land, you have that power. But someone's coming into there, vice versa. Often, if you give a person a choice to meet somewhere, Often they might say their location or their home, because again, it's something that they feel comfortable with. They know the lay of the land, it's their own domain. So they feel like they have some power because you're coming in to assess their life. They're going to talk to you about their lives, their experiences. They feel like they need a bit of comfort. So that has a different dynamic of how an interview will play out. Or finally, they may offer to sit in a neutral space, which is often the most perfect, but is often the most hardest to get. So that could be in a cafe, or something like that, where they feel it's great because there's no power dynamics then, because you're in a neutral space, and often, sometimes, if a respondent does leave their own space, be that an office and a work environment, to a neutral space, they probably feel that they can be more open because they're physically out of their own setting. And then finally, whether you offer them food or drink is going to build rapport, but it can also influence them potentially. Like, oh, well, they took time out of their days to come travel to me, they've offered me a coffee, or I better tell them what they want. Now, often in my personal experience, often I find that people do want to meet in neutral spaces or on their own location, and then often the interviewee will offer me any food or drink for making the time to come and see them. So it's almost like them building that rapport already, and it's coming from them. So whether you don't offer them food or drink as well, is that going to hinder your rapport? You've got to weigh those things up. So just be aware of that. Okay, and then the next one we're going to do is I'm going to discuss different types of focus groups and field observations. And also I will have a video on how to actually put all this together to do this as an online one.